want to talk about, very briefly, 3 types of mystical experience. Now, what I'm going to do is, after Atheism for Lent, I'm going to do at least 2 Paro seminars on this topic, maybe 3. So this is kind of like signposting where I'm going to go after Atheism for Lent. But I thought it would be worth talking about it here briefly, if you don't mind. And if you do mind, you can't really tell me, so so I'll just blast on as if you're okay with it. So last week I looked at a particular type of mystical experience that I'm going to call apocalyptic, and I'll mention why I call it apocalyptic in a second, but I'm going to sandwich that between 2 other types of mystical experience. One of them that really connects with Simone Weil, and the other that I don't think directly connects with any of the readings, maybe of last week directly, but is probably the most popular type of religious experience. Simone Weil, by the way, is, out of all of those people we looked at last week, probably the closest to parotheology. All right? And I could have put her on week 6. So there's a few thinkers where it's really hard to know where to place them, because any great thinker is more complicated than slotting them into a particular thing. So if you ever hear, and I see this on YouTube all the time, people who kind of want to slot a great thinker into a very narrow field. Oh, this person is about the inner world, the individual inner world, and this person's about the external, whatever. And you kind of place, great thinkers generally can't be kind of, placed very easily in one spot, right? I mean, to some extent they can. There's a history of the unfolding of thought, so there is a truth to it. But someone like Simone Weil, for example, I had great difficulty knowing where to put her in this course. And I think next time, I'm going to do a revamp of this next year. I'm hoping to put a lot of new material in, and I might put Weil near the end. So maybe it'll become clearer why I might do that in a second. So what are the 3 mystical experiences? If you remember last week, I tried to bring real conceptual clarity to what mysticism is by using these Kantian terms, concept and intuition. Intuition is our experience of the world, of real things, our experience of encounters with singular things in the world, right? This is a singular cup, right? But this cup, I have a concept of, and the concept includes color, it includes shapes, all of these things that like shape a circle. Even if there were no circles in the world, I could still have a concept of a circle in my mind. And I talked about how in everyday life, the concept and then the intuition, they interweave and they intermingle. And regular experiences, what Marion calls pure phenomenon, is a regular experiences where I have a concept of something like a cat, and then I encounter real cats in the world. And as I encounter cats, the concept gets enriched, but the concept never is filled out completely, right? There's always a bit of disparity, and it's like the coffee in this coffee cup. The intuition fills the concept, and it develops it and expands it, but it doesn't quite ever match the concept itself. So that's everyday experience. I encounter things in the world, I have concepts in my mind, universal concepts. And so in light of that, I want to talk about the first type of mystical experience, the one that we all know, and I'm going to call it Oceanic experience. And I haven't read anybody who differentiates in this way, but I think it's a good way to differentiate. So this is what I'm writing about at the moment, as I said. So Oceanic experience is the experience of feeling at one with everything. And I want to describe that as the complete merging of concept and intuition. And what I mean by that is, in that experience of oceanic oneness, your experience of something and your inner world, mind and matter, completely meld together so that there's no inside or outside. You actually don't even know if you're inside or outside, because it's almost like being in a flotation tank. Where you lose track of your body, because if you're in a flotation tank and it's the same temperature as your body and you're in darkness, the boundary of your inside and outside world can kind of disappear briefly. And that could be described as this oceanic experience in which someone feels no disparity between the inside and the outside. And that's what you see in people like Ken Wilber and Alan Watts and Jordan Peterson. They talk about this, and it's often called enlightenment or waking up or integral spirituality, but it's a type of experiencing no disparity between mind and matter, concept and intuition, outside and inside. That experience can be experienced positively and negatively. I mean, people experience it when they do DMT, when they have a psychotic break, but also when they meditate. Sometimes when they do certain spiritual practices, right? You can experience that. That's one. And these are all linked in some very interesting way. I'm not going to say why, because that will be when we look at this in proper seminars in a few months. But they are connected in some way. So there's the oceanic experience of oneness. That's what we often think about when we think about the mystical experience. Then there's the apocalyptic, and that's what I was talking about last week, because the apocalyptic is very central to Christian mysticism. If oceanic experience, it could be connected to anywhere, you could say it's connected to the Eastern religions a lot, not exclusively so, but you find that kind of thinking, especially in, say, Westernized Buddhism, you have that notion of oceanic oneness. The Western tradition has this notion of the apocalyptic event, and that's where, as I mentioned last week, intuition exceeds concept, where you encounter something that short circuits your ideas, that fries your brain, that decenters you, that traumatizes you in some way. So that's the apocalyptic spiritual experience. And then the third is, I want to call the abyssal religious experience, and that's what Simone Weil was talking about. And so when you read last week the different people, there's two probably stood out, but Simone Weil is the one that probably stood out the most, because her understanding of God is not so much hyper presence, something that is hyper real, but rather almost like something that is hyper absent, completely powerfully like a crack in being. And the way she describes it, and I've talked about this elsewhere, I won't go into detail, but she uses the example. She says, what does a miser lose when they lose their treasure? Because the idea is that a miser gets some enjoyment from having the treasure, the money they have. They don't get the pleasure from spending it. So they weirdly have it and don't have it. But if you ever steal money from a miser, they're going to be traumatized, even though they don't use it. So Simone Weil is like, well, what do they lose when they lose their fortune? Because they never used the money. And Simone Weil very powerfully writes about how the miser has a certain type of quantum relationship to the treasure. They both have it and don't have it. It's like wave particle duality, right? They orient themselves around the treasure, never being too close to it or too far from it. And it generates a pleasure for the miser. And Simone Weil uses this to say that the universe has to have a quantum dimension to it. There has to be a type of gap or lack or spatiality for desire to occur, for human desire to erupt. And for Weil, religion at its best provides us with an orientation to this lack. And God is a name for this ontological crack in reality. So that's Simone Weil, and I say we're going to look at that more in a few weeks. Every week builds on the last, so we just do 1 week at a time. But Simone Weil kind of is kind of connecting with what could be called an abyssal. So we have the oceanic experience, the apocalyptic experience, and the abyssal experience.